The local police chief walked into the residence of a missing 84-year-old woman and immediately declared it the scene of a violent kidnapping. And conversely, if the victim voluntarily opened her door and stepped outside, why was there a single isolated pool of blood discovered out on the front porch? The local forces were effectively paralyzed by the sheer amount of time that had elapsed before they were even notified. They sprinted into action, but they were running in the wrong direction entirely. The data from the machines provided the exact parameters of the crime, but the human investigators were too distracted by the initial panic to properly analyze the timeline. The 10-hour void allowed the true narrative to be manipulated and obscured before the first officer ever crossed the threshold of the property. The cold, hard data from the medical network and the security system stood in direct opposition to the frantic human response. The machines recorded a swift takedown, while the resulting local investigation was chaotic and completely fruitless in those crucial early hours. The stage was now set for a massive paradigm shift. The realization that the local authorities were operating on fundamentally flawed assumptions created a massive shock to the entire system. The local department had built their public narrative around the concept of a terrifying random home invasion. These are the terrifying contradictions that happen when initial panic clouds actual forensic science. They believed a violent predator had shattered the peace of the neighborhood and forcefully dragged the victim away. But this theory began to crumble the moment the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped onto the property and deployed advanced forensic techniques. The federal agents did not rely on the frantic testimonies of the initial witnesses. They relied on ultraviolet light and chemical reagents. When they thoroughly processed the interior of the house, they uncovered a truth that was far more disturbing than a simple burglary. The inside of the residence was perfectly intact. The forensic reports allegedly described the interior environment as eerily untouched. There was absolutely no blood splatter on the walls. There were no overturned chairs or broken lamps to suggest a desperate fight for survival. The microscopic evidence inside the home completely contradicted the public narrative of a violent struggle. The local department saw what they expected to see based on the frantic statements of those who arrived first. This revelation forced a total reset of the investigation. The destruction and the violence were completely isolated to a single specific point outside the front door. The camera had been tampered with, and a single pool of blood was located on the exterior porch. The interior sanctuary remained completely pristine. This physical impossibility is the exact reason the federal authorities officially stripped the local police of their jurisdictional control. The local forces were actively hunting for a violent home invader, but the physical evidence proved that no violent invasion had actually occurred inside the structure. This shocking reveal fundamentally alters the entire trajectory of the case. If the masked man with the gun did not force his way inside to commit the crime, then how did the victim end up outside on the porch where the blood was found? There are only two logical forensic explanations for this perfectly clean interior. The first terrifying possibility is that the victim recognized her attacker and voluntarily opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch before the violence commenced. But the federal agent saw only what the physical environment proved. The second and far more sinister possibility is that the interior of the home was meticulously cleaned and professionally staged before the emergency call was ever placed at 12:03 p.m. The lack of interior evidence is not a sign of a peaceful exit. It is a glaring anomaly that suggests either a fatal betrayal of trust or a highly sophisticated cover-up. The pristine living room stands in horrifying contrast to the violence that clearly took place just feet away on the concrete porch. The local police simply lacked the specialized training to recognize this subtle but massive discrepancy. They looked at a clean room and assumed the violence happened elsewhere. The federal agents looked at a clean room and immediately suspected foul play from within the perimeter. This is the turning point where the case stops being a random tragedy and becomes a highly calculated puzzle. If you want to understand how forensic science systematically dismantles false narratives, the stark contrast between the chaotic official story and the perfectly silent rooms indicates a terrifying level of either investigative incompetence or deliberate misdirection, and exposes the real timeline of a crime. Make sure to turn on your notifications right now. We are going to break down exactly how the federal agents used the remaining physical evidence to track the phantom in the security footage. The clean room was the first major clue that the official story was a complete fabrication. The transition of power to the federal agents marked the beginning of the actual scientific inquiry. The local department had inadvertently allowed the true narrative to slip through their fingers by taking the scene at face value. The agents understood that a lack of evidence is often the most powerful evidence of all. An untouched room in a major missing persons case is a screaming siren to a trained investigator. It points directly to premeditation and absolute control. The pristine environment was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice made by someone who had the time to ensure the interior revealed absolutely nothing. With the jurisdictional battle settled, the federal investigators pivoted to a phase of methodical deduction. When local theories fail, federal forensics step in. They completely ignored the confusing witness statements and focused exclusively on the tangible physical artifacts left behind. They had to rebuild the case from the ground up using only the items they could scientifically verify. The first major breakthrough arrived on February 5th. Laboratory technicians officially confirmed that the isolated pool of blood found on the exterior porch belonged definitively to Nancy. This was the irrefutable biological proof that a violent event had occurred right at the threshold of the home. It cemented the theory that the violence was contained entirely to the outside perimeter, further highlighting the suspicious nature of the pristine interior. The confirmation of the blood elevated the urgency of the federal probe. In response, the authorities officially increased the reward money to a staggering $100,000, hoping to shatter the silence surrounding the masked figure. 5 days later, on February 10th, the investigation released the most compelling visual evidence to the public. They published the recovered security footage showing the masked man approaching the residence. To follow the evidence where it truly leads past the rumors and straight to the facts, make sure to subscribe to Seth Crime Stories. The video provided crucial details about the suspect. He was wearing a specific style of jacket, he carried a backpack, and most importantly, he was clearly brandishing a handgun. The visual confirmation of the weapon instantly escalated the threat assessment. This was an armed and highly prepared individual operating with specific intent. The federal agents now had a confirmed biological sample from the victim and a clear visual profile of the alleged attacker. The methodical pursuit was yielding significant results. The net appeared to be tightening around the suspect captured on the digital recording. The investigative momentum continued to build when forensic teams scouring the immediate area discovered a discarded glove near the property line. This was the exact type of physical artifact investigators desperately need to break a case wide open. The glove was meticulously processed by the crime laboratory, and analysts successfully extracted a viable profile of foreign DNA. The entire investigative team braced for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. We do not just read the headlines, we analyze the crime scene. They had the weapon, they had the timeline, and now they possessed the genetic signature of the person who had supposedly worn the glove. The pieces were aligning perfectly to close the trap on the man in the video. The database search was initiated with the expectation of a direct match to a known violent offender, but the meticulous scientific process suddenly delivered a result that completely derailed the entire federal strategy. The DNA extracted from the glove did not belong to a hardened criminal or a contract killer. The laboratory results positively identified the genetic material as belonging to a local restaurant employee. After a rapid and intense background investigation, the federal agents were forced to conclude that this individual had absolutely no connection to the crime or the victim. The employee was completely innocent. The glove was nothing more than discarded debris that happened to blow near the crime scene. It was a massive forensic red herring. The emotional whiplash of this discovery was devastating to the momentum of the case. The investigators had methodically followed the physical evidence only to be led into a complete blind alley. To uncover what actually transpired in those dark hours, we have to completely discard the definitive genetic proof they thought they possessed was completely worthless. This sudden failure of the physical evidence forced the federal team to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about the masked man. The pristine interior of the house, the isolated blood on the porch, and now a piece of useless DNA. The case was actively resisting every attempt at logical deduction. The physical evidence was not simply lacking, it was actively deceiving the investigators. The methodical approach had successfully cleared away the initial local errors, but it had now run headfirst into a highly sophisticated wall of confusion. The agents were back to square one, possessing a video of an armed phantom and a verified pool of blood, but lacking any tangible link to a suspect in the real world. The physical investigation had stalled completely, forcing the federal authorities to look beyond the immediate crime scene and dive into the chaotic and deeply suspicious world of digital extortion, press conferences, and rebuild the timeline using only the physical and digital breadcrumbs left behind. The failure of the DNA evidence was a brutal reminder that forensic science can only interpret the items recovered. It cannot magically conjure the truth if the scene has been manipulated. The agents realized they were hunting an adversary who understood how to leave behind useless clues to consume federal resources. The glove was a perfect distraction. It kept the laboratories busy and the agents focused on the wrong trail while the true perpetrator slipped further into the shadows. The physical world had offered a compelling narrative that turned out to be completely false. To find the real answers, the investigators would have to abandon the dirt and concrete and turn their attention to the highly encrypted pathways of the internet. The investigation was actively spiraling into a physical dead end when a new and entirely digital dimension violently ripped the case open. With the genetic material completely invalidated, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was forced to pivot their massive resources toward a different kind of trace evidence. They abandoned the physical dirt of the crime scene and entered the highly encrypted architecture of the dark web. Shortly after the disappearance, the authorities intercepted a highly sophisticated communication. The community panicked as authorities painted a picture of a brutal abduction taking place in the dead of night. We must look closely at the fragile reality of the victim before the chaos descended upon her doorstep. An anonymous sender transmitted an extortion letter demanding a specific and substantial cryptocurrency payment in exchange for the safe return of the missing 84-year-old. The perpetrators explicitly requested a transfer ranging from 0.5 to 1 full Bitcoin. This was not a ransom note written on a piece of torn paper. It was a digital command that required technical fluency to even process. The inclusion of this demand completely shattered the remaining fragments of the random burglary theory. A desperate addict looking for quick cash does not demand decentralized digital currency. They steal televisions and jewelry. The demand for Bitcoin elevated the threat matrix to a level of organized white-collar criminality. It suggested an adversary who understood international money laundering and the complexities of the blockchain. Federal cybersecurity analysts immediately launched a massive tracing operation. They began attempting to follow the digital footprints left behind by the encrypted emails. We have to strip away the sensationalism and look at the quiet moments right before the incident. The blockchain is often mistakenly believed to be entirely anonymous, but federal algorithms can sometimes map the routing networks to expose the geographical origin of a sender. The cyber units worked around the clock to dissect the digital extortion attempt. But this new avenue of inquiry introduced a severe logical complication that frustrated the entire task force. In a standard kidnapping scenario, the primary objective is leverage. The captors must prove they actually possess the victim to guarantee the financial transaction. Yet the senders of this digital demand provided absolutely zero proof of life. They offered no recent photograph and no audio recording. They simply demanded a massive sum of untraceable currency and vanished back into the encrypted void. This glaring omission fundamentally changed how the behavioral science units profiled the communication. If there is no proof of life, then the demand might not be a genuine attempt at extortion. It might be an elaborate smokescreen. The truth of this mystery does not begin with a shattered camera or a frantic emergency call. The federal agents had to consider the terrifying possibility that the entire cryptocurrency demand was mathematically generated to waste their time. It was a perfect digital decoy designed to force cyber analysts to chase imaginary IP addresses across the globe, while the physical perpetrators solidified their escape locally. The letters injected a profound sense of paranoia into the command center. Every piece of digital data was now suspect. Was the sender the actual man captured on the surveillance system, or was it an opportunistic hacker reading the news and attempting to capitalize on a high-profile tragedy? The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not typically release details regarding the validity of extortion attempts, but the sheer volume of resources dedicated to tracing these specific blockchain transactions indicates they believe the sender possessed at least some intimate knowledge of the incident. The cyber manhunt expanded the scope of the case from a quiet desert community to a global digital network. But the deeper the agents dug into the code, the further away they seemed to get from the physical reality of the missing woman. It begins with the delicate illusion of safety surrounding a woman who completely relied on modern technology just to stay alive. The digital realm is endless, and the perpetrators clearly knew how to exploit its shadows. They built a maze of false leads and dead links that consumed hundreds of analytical hours. The tension within the federal task force continued to mount as days turned into weeks without a single physical sighting. They had a clean interior, a useless biological sample, and a phantom digital ransom note. None of the pieces fit together. The evidence was actively contradicting itself at every turn. The sophisticated nature of the extortion demand directly conflicted with the blunt force trauma implied by the biological evidence recovered at the threshold. A criminal enterprise capable of executing a flawless digital extortion campaign usually does not leave behind a bloody and chaotic exterior perimeter. The entire operational profile was fractured. The authorities were dealing with a ghost who was simultaneously sloppy enough to be recorded on camera, yet sophisticated enough to manipulate the international blockchain. This agonizing paradox forced the investigators to stop looking outward at the unknown assailants and begin a highly uncomfortable inward examination. The fragility of human life is often hidden behind a false veneer of security and daily routine. The digital anomalies and the physical impossibilities were pointing toward a much closer and far more disturbing origin point. Do you believe the cryptocurrency demand was a legitimate ransom request or a calculated distraction? The answer to that question unlocks the most terrifying theory of the entire federal investigation. The realization that they were likely chasing a meticulously constructed illusion brought the federal investigation to a complete and devastating standstill. The conflicting data points could only be reconciled by introducing a theory that the local authorities had completely failed to recognize. Former federal agent Jennifer Coffindaffer offered a chilling independent analysis that shattered the remaining public narrative. She pointed directly at the glaring contradiction between the intense violence on the exterior and the pristine stillness of the interior. When the external evidence violently conflicts with the internal environment, the most logical forensic conclusion is that the scene has been deliberately staged. This is the absolute peak of the investigative nightmare. The federal agents were no longer simply looking for an unknown intruder who broke in. For Nancy Guthrie, her entire existence was tethered to a relentless electronic rhythm. They were now actively investigating the possibility that the entire event was orchestrated from within the perimeter before the emergency systems were ever activated. This paradigm shift cast a dark and suffocating shadow over the surviving inner circle. The investigative lens aggressively refocused on the massive temporal void that defined the night. The medical device had permanently ceased transmission at 2:28 in the morning. The official plea for police assistance was not logged until 12:03 in the afternoon. That is nearly 10 complete hours of absolute silence. The most critical question of the entire case transformed from who was standing outside the door to who was standing inside the house during that massive gap. The media scrutiny intensified into a relentless firestorm, particularly surrounding the son Cameron Guthrie. Journalists and former investigators began publicly questioning the dynamics of those early morning hours. What exactly did the family members see when they first arrived? She did not just rely on locked doors and neighborhood watch programs to feel safe in her home. How does a frantic search for a missing elderly relative result in a perfectly undisturbed living room? The authorities have not issued any formal accusations, but the sheer weight of the circumstantial anomalies creates an atmosphere of profound suspicion. If the scene was staged, then the man on the surveillance footage was not a random attacker. He was an invited participant. He was either a hired operative executing a specific contract, or he was a theatrical element introduced to provide a convenient suspect for the cameras. The terrifying implication is that the victim did not walk out into an ambush. She was delivered into one. This theory perfectly explains why the local police were initially fooled. They responded to a script that had been written for them hours in advance. The perpetrators knew exactly how law enforcement would react to an open door and a frantic family. They counted on the initial chaos to destroy any subtle trace evidence that might contradict their narrative. The Federal Bureau of Investigation recognized this manipulation only after the crucial first 48 hours had already been squandered by the local response. Her literal survival depended entirely on a medical pacemaker. The sheer audacity required to stage a major federal crime scene indicates a coldness that goes far beyond a simple financial motive. It points to a deep and complex interpersonal fracture. The investigators are now tasked with deconstructing not just the physical evidence, but the psychological architecture of the entire family unit. They have to map the emotional fault lines to find the true motive buried beneath the digital lies. The standoff between the scientific truth and the manufactured narrative is the defining conflict of this entire ordeal. The physical evidence proves a violent extraction occurred, but the contextual evidence suggests it was an inside job disguised as an external threat. This is why the federal agents completely seized control. They realized they were not hunting a burglar, they were unraveling a conspiracy. The pristine rooms were not a sign of peace, they were a sign of total control. The delay in contacting the authorities was not a simple misunderstanding. This small device was designed to constantly monitor her cardiac activity and continuously transmit that vital data to external medical networks. It was the necessary time required to sanitize the environment and finalize the script. The entire incident was a performance, and the local police were merely the unwitting audience. The ultimate twist is that the most dangerous elements of this crime did not arrive in the dark wearing a mask. The most dangerous elements may have already been inside the house when the sun went down. The federal pursuit is now a high-stakes game of psychological warfare. They possess the medical data and the blockchain records, but they desperately need to crack the human element. They need someone within that inner circle to break protocol and reveal what truly happened during those missing 10 hours. The silence is deafening, and it is protecting a secret that the federal government is determined to expose at any cost. Please hit the like button if you appreciate how complex forensic staging can completely alter a federal timeline. Your support helps us continue to analyze these deep investigative layers. It was an invisible digital lifeline meant to alert professionals the moment her body faltered. The current state of the investigation exists in a rigid and unforgiving stalemate between advanced technology and human deception. The federal authorities have officially established complete dominance over the inquiry, entirely marginalizing the local police department. The federal agents have systematically discarded every single piece of initial witness testimony, recognizing that the human accounts are fundamentally corrupted by either extreme trauma or deliberate fabrication. They are now relying exclusively on the cold and impartial data streams provided by the Internet of Things. The encrypted logs from the medical device and the complex routing histories of the cryptocurrency demands are the only witnesses the federal government trusts. The entire weight of the American justice system is currently laser focused on decoding the anomalies within that data. But despite the massive deployment of resources, the foundational mystery remains completely unresolved. The massive $100,000 reward is still active, waiting for an informant willing to risk their life to expose the network. The authorities are gambling that a financial incentive of that magnitude will eventually shatter the loyalty of a fellow conspirator. But when federal investigators formally took control of the case and illuminated the rooms with, "But this advanced piece of medical technology would ultimately serve a much darker purpose," they know that a staged scene of this complexity requires multiple actors, and secrets are exceptionally difficult to maintain when the pressure reaches federal levels. The reward is not just a plea for public assistance. It is a highly aggressive tactical maneuver designed to sow deep paranoia among the perpetrators. If multiple individuals were involved in the staging and execution, they must now live with the constant terror that their partner might suddenly accept the federal payout and secure complete legal immunity. The psychological pressure is immense and carefully calculated, yet the physical reality of the situation remains incredibly grim. The vast and unforgiving desert surrounding the community has been meticulously scoured by aerial drones and specialized canine ground teams. But the harsh landscape refuses to yield its secrets. The transition from a local missing persons case to a massive federal conspiracy probe has not brought the victim any closer to being physically located. It would transform from a tool of healing into an impartial electronic witness. The meticulous forensic work successfully exposed the initial lies, but it has not yet revealed the ultimate truth. The investigation is permanently trapped in a frustrating limbo where the authorities know exactly how the physical illusion was created, but they cannot definitively identify the primary architect. The lingering question that continues to haunt the highest levels of the investigative command centers revolves entirely around those original 15 minutes of physical execution. The internal medical data definitively proves that the entire operation, from the external perimeter breach to the final cessation of the biological signal, took exactly 900 seconds. How does an operation seamlessly transition from an apparent state of quiet normalcy to a complete and total vanishing in such an incredibly microscopic window of time? Even if the entire interior environment was perfectly staged, the actual physical removal of an adult human being requires immense logistical planning, transportation, and an absolute absence of hesitation. The sheer mechanical efficiency of the extraction heavily suggests a level of professional capability that is rarely seen outside of specialized military or cartel units. It would become the exact countdown clock recording the precise moments of her disappearance. The authorities are left staring at a theoretically perfect crime constructed in the middle of a heavily monitored suburban environment. The local forces unfortunately trampled the initial scene, but the federal agents managed to salvage the undeniable digital truth. The case now hinges entirely on a slow and agonizing battle of attrition. The investigators must simply wait for the encrypted digital data to finally crack, or for the immense psychological pressure of the reward money to force a fatal human mistake. The profound silence of the surrounding desert is matched only by the defiant silence of the specific individuals who hold the answers. The ultimate resolution remains completely hidden, waiting for a single verifiable fact to finally break through the elaborate theatrical staging. The entire federal apparatus is locked in a waiting game. They are actively monitoring every digital transaction and every known associate, hoping that the sheer weight of the investigation will eventually force the hidden network to fracture and collapse under its own gravity. The evening of January 31st appeared entirely normal and devoid of any impending threat. What this case teaches us about the mechanics of a staged crime scene is absolutely crucial for understanding modern investigative protocols. The primary and most reliable indicator of a manufactured environment is a stark physical disproportion. In this specific incident, the intense destructive force required to shatter an external security camera and leave a biological trace entirely contradicts the undisturbed perfection of the internal living space. A genuine chaotic event radiates damage outward from the epicenter. When investigators discover extreme violence, artificially isolated to a single external point, while the interior remains completely sterile, it is a definitive forensic signature of staging. This deliberate manipulation forces analysts to completely discard the visual narrative and rely entirely on hidden metrics. Furthermore, what this case teaches us about the rapid evolution of forensics highlights a monumental shift in the justice system. We have officially transitioned away from an era dependent on human recollection. The modern investigative landscape is completely dominated by the Internet of Things. At exactly 9:50 p.m., her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, dropped her off at the residence. The human witnesses in this case offered narratives that were immediately dismantled by a medical pacemaker and a decentralized blockchain ledger. Hardware devices and encrypted financial networks do not possess the capacity to lie or forget. The criminal justice framework is rapidly adapting to a reality where the most reliable testimony is extracted from silicon chips rather than sworn affidavits. The ability to mathematically verify a timeline using biometric data and cryptocurrency routing has completely stripped criminals of their ability to control the investigative narrative. The future of solving complex federal crimes relies entirely on the capacity to decrypt the silent signals constantly broadcasting from the devices we wear and the networks we trust. The transition from human witness to digital witness is absolute, total, and permanent. The final echo of this massive investigation always returns to the absolute silence of the medical monitors. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, A vital connection to the world was permanently severed. The local authorities initially chose to believe the frantic stories they were told by the people standing in the aftermath. He was the last verified individual to see her in a state of normalcy. But the Federal Bureau of Investigation chose to believe the cold and impartial data recorded by the machines. This case stands as a terrifying reminder that human beings are capable of executing incredibly dark and complex deceptions. They can clean a room, they can plant a false biological sample, and they can spin a narrative designed to completely misdirect the entire justice system. But they cannot alter the digital heartbeat recorded on a remote medical server. Sometimes the most honest witness to a horrific crime is simply a small piece of unfeeling technology. If you want to see exactly how investigators dismantle another complex web of family lies, you must watch our next breakdown right here. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover how another staged crime scene was completely destroyed by microscopic forensic evidence. The transition from the outside world to the quiet interior of the house was smooth. The doors closed, and the perimeter was presumably secured for the night. Inside the house, the environment was calm. The pacemaker continued its steady transmission of data, confirming that she was resting peacefully. This is the precise point where the illusion of safety is the most potent. The technology was functioning flawlessly. Their own forensic tools, they discovered a reality that completely contradicted the local narrative. The digital heartbeat pulsed across the network, creating a profound sense of security for anyone monitoring from afar. But the inherent flaw in this technological safety net is its singular focus. A medical device is meticulously engineered to detect an internal biological failure. It is completely blind to external threats. It cannot sound an alarm when a shadow moves across the front lawn. It cannot detect the metallic click of a weapon being readied in the darkness. The creeping unease of this case stems directly from this technological blind spot. While the pacemaker dutifully broadcasted a healthy rhythm, someone was already moving into position outside the house. The electronic data painted a picture of absolute serenity, while the physical reality was rapidly deteriorating into a nightmare. The closed doors offered no real protection against a calculated intrusion. The invisible digital shield was entirely useless against a physical breach. Inside the home, the environment was reportedly eerily untouched. The quiet house was simply waiting for the inevitable disruption. The rhythmic transmission of medical data provided a false comfort to a family that would soon be shattered. It is deeply unsettling to realize that a machine designed to save a life ended up merely documenting the exact minute that life was violently interrupted. The heart kept beating in the quiet home, but a threat was already waiting just beyond the threshold. The contrast between the internal peace and the external danger creates a chilling atmosphere of inevitability. The system was never designed to protect her from a predator. It was only designed to record the baseline before the anomaly occurred. Every single beat transmitted through the network was another second slipping away before the intrusion began. The house itself was a quiet trap. The electronic monitoring provided an artificial peace of mind that masked the very real vulnerabilities of the physical structure. While the medical network confirmed her steady vital signs, the surrounding darkness concealed an approach that would soon sever that connection permanently. There were absolutely no signs of a physical struggle. The furniture was perfectly in place. The quiet moments after 9:50 p.m. were not a period of rest. They were the final silent preparations for a strike. The technology was awake, but the human element was completely unaware of the approaching violence. The timeline of the actual incident accelerates with a cold and clinical precision that leaves investigators breathless. This was not a slow escalating situation. It was a rapid and highly coordinated strike executed within a terrifyingly narrow window. According to the independent analysis provided by former federal agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, the entire operation, from the initial approach to the total loss of biological signal, was executed in a mere 15 minutes. This tight time frame completely redefines the nature of the crime. At exactly 2:12 a.m., the security perimeter was breached. A masked individual armed with a handgun approached the front porch. Nothing had been broken or moved a single centimeter. This was not a random burglar looking for an easy target. The intruder immediately targeted and physically tampered with the exterior security camera. This deliberate action demonstrates a clear understanding of the surveillance layout and a premeditated intent to operate in the blind spot. For the next 16 minutes, the physical events remain a mystery hidden from the electronic eyes. But at exactly 2:28 a.m., the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case was generated. The pacemaker completely stopped transmitting its signal. The connection to the medical network was abruptly and permanently severed. The digital heartbeat simply vanished into the digital void. This is the exact moment the incident reached its violent climax. The timeline then flatlines for hours. The house sat in silence while the sun rose. It was not until 11:56 a.m. when Nancy failed to log into her scheduled online church service that the alarm was finally raised. This shocking physical disparity lies at the very core of a mystery that forced the Federal Bureau of Investigation to seize command from the local jurisdiction. The family, realizing something was profoundly wrong, rushed to the residence. At exactly 12:03 p.m., the initial emergency call was placed to 911. The gap between the final transmission of the pacemaker at 2:28 a.m. and the emergency call at 12:03 p.m. represents nearly 10 missing hours. That is an eternity in a missing persons investigation. During those 10 hours, the trail grew cold, the perpetrator vanished, and the physical environment was left completely unattended. When the local authorities finally arrived, they were already 10 hours behind a highly organized operation. They rushed onto the scene, acting on the frantic assumptions of the family. They immediately began treating the situation as a chaotic and violent abduction, actively chasing a phantom suspect through the surrounding desert. They deployed resources and manpower based on a narrative of forced entry and violent struggle. If a violent predator forced his way inside and dragged a woman into the night, why was the interior completely undisturbed? But while the local police were busy chasing a ghost, the actual physical evidence was sitting completely undisturbed right beneath their feet. The initial response was completely disjointed from the clinical reality of the timeline. The 15-minute window of execution, followed by the 10-hour delay in reporting, created a massive informational void. The authorities were operating in the dark, reacting to emotional pleas rather than forensic facts. The rapid succession of the camera tampering followed immediately by the medical device failure points to a highly specific and targeted action. It does not point to a random home invasion that spiraled out of control. It points to a deliberate mission with a singular objective. The clinical acceleration of the timeline forces a completely different perspective on the events of that night. It demands that we stop looking at the emotional aftermath and focus entirely on the precise mechanical steps taken by the intruder. The discrepancy between the swift execution of the crime and the agonizingly slow realization of the disappearance is the most frustrating aspect of the early investigation.